Dear colleagues, I'm happy to open this session with my presentation on income stratification in modern Russia. But first, I also would like to express my thanks to Branko Milanovic because he provided such a brilliant picture of the global inequality. And on this background, I will try to position some of the results of what is happening in our country, because that's the interesting question for the people who work here. But I would try to refer to some of the questions that he also raised in his presentation, because these are the same questions that we are dealing with when we are describing the Russian society. The problem with the inequalities, the dissatisfaction with inequalities, and what is generally happening in our country. So I chose the topic of income stratification, and basically income stratification usually deals with three broad categories: defining poor, defining middle strata or middle class, and defining well-off or high-income population, and maybe different subgroups between or within them. From the first sight, it seems quite a straightforward approach to society stratification, and it can be used for international comparisons because income is a universal indicator. It is also important for social policy because we talk about people who are eligible for welfare depending on the thresholds we use to define poor and vulnerable. But at the same time, choosing a scale for the income stratification of the society as whole is not a trivial methodological exercise, because different approaches were designed for different societies that are at the different stages of their socio-economic development. So they're only applicable to Russia to a certain extent. So the main question that I would like to focus on: how does income stratification currently looks in Russia from the points of view of different approaches, and what does it tell us about inequality in Russia with all the other facts that we know about inequality from statistics and other data. So all the approaches to income-based stratification can be divided into two broad categories: absolute approaches and relative approaches. That is similar to defining absolute poverty and relative poverty. In Russia, I think that absolute approach is more familiar to researchers because it is used in Russian statistics for official definition of the poverty. So we all know that we have this subsistence level that is set regionally, and the people who have incomes below this level are considered to be poor. So in 2019, we had about 14% of the poor in Russia according to this absolute official approach. Absolute approaches are also used in international practices. For example, one very well-cited approach is developed by World Bank. There are also variations in the boundaries that are used for defining income groups, but I've chosen one of the common version that is used for Russia as well. We can define poor, vulnerable, people who are vulnerable to poverty, and middle class. But as we see, if we apply these thresholds to current Russian situation, we can see that it doesn't work as a stratification model, because we have no extreme poverty. Even in times of economic crisis, it's about 2%. We have just about 10% of vulnerable people who are vulnerable to poverty, people who have high risks of poverty. But most of the population, according to these thresholds, falls within middle class. And this is the result of the fundamental changes in income that has taken place during just the last 15 years. So in the year of 2000, only 27% of Russian population comprised the middle class, and now it's almost 90%. So that's not the problem of the approach, but it's the question that Russia has undergone fundamental transformations. The reasons for that are the topic of separate discussion, but still, we have seen a large growth of incomes that doesn't allow us to use most methods that are based on absolute approach and set middle class income at $10 or $13 per day if we talk about these values in PPP. And we can also see that if we compare Russia with other countries, this is just, I can say, kind of a random selection of the countries that represent Europe and represent Latin America, and we also have China, that income stratification in Russia, by its configuration, is different than in China or Latin America, and much closer to that of Western Europe. Of course, the absolute level of income would be different, but still, just the general configuration puts Russia closer to the so-called developed countries. If we talk about relative approach, because we had this idea that we wanted to build a stratification model for the whole society, that we can define income groups that would be kind of homogenic in themselves and will let us allow to analyze the structure, the income structure of Russian society and the dynamics of it in recent years. So we tried to look among relative approaches as well. Relative approaches can also, they also exist in different versions. So they can be based on percentile distribution or comparison with the average or median income in the country. I wouldn't stop on the percentile distribution. This information can be found in our official statistics. It also provides very important information about, for example, from this table we can see how the poor people were getting poorer and wealthier people were getting better off during the last years. But this approach is sometimes criticized because it doesn't allow to see the changes in the sizes of these income groups. So another type of relative approach based on median income. We define income groups based on the comparison of the measurement of their income against the median income in the country. So we are saying that we are looking at the national standard, at the standard that we have in the country, and we define middle income groups on the basis of how their incomes correspond to this typical standard of living, typical standard of income in the country. This approach is also widely used in literature, but usually not for the society as a whole. So we know that we have relative poverty, that is, and the boundary for it is usually set at 0.5, 0.6, or sometimes 0.7 of the national median. We have some works devoted to the wealthy people, and this boundary of the wealth is usually set at about 1.5 median and up to 3 medians. And when we talk about middle class, there is no universal way to define middle class in the framework of this approach, but usually the logic is that middle class are the people who have median income, so the incomes around the median from 0.5 to 125 or maybe to 2 median, so people who have about median income. So we combined all these approaches and we did some statistical testing to show that the groups that we define are homogenic in their structure. And we propose defining 5 large groups in Russian society. They can be split even in smaller groups. We have another model that comprises 7 income groups, but I think this is more comprehensible and easier to describe. So 5 income groups. We have median group, that's what I was talking about. These are people who have incomes around the median, so from 0.75 to 1.25 of the national income. We have vulnerable people with the same logic that this group of people is comprised of those who have high risks of poverty. They're not poor as such, but they have high risks of poverty. And if economic conditions in Russia changes, they are the first candidates to go back to the poor group. The threshold for the poor group is quite standard, it's 0.5 median. And we also have 2 groups that can be considered more well-off. Middle class, it's not in the middle considering the median, it's where the mean income falls. And high income group with the incomes over 2 median. So if we apply these thresholds to the data, I'm a sociologist, so I basically use social surveys data. RLMS HSE, it's a monitoring carried out by our Higher School of Economics household survey. So if we apply this to the data, we can see that Russia can be currently characterized as a middle, not middle class, but middle income. Russian income stratification model can be characterized as a middle income, middle class stratification. More than 1/3 of population falls within median group, and we have quite a large share of middle class. It's about 1/4 of the population, and also 1/4 belongs to the groups that are poor or vulnerable. This approach is also useful and good because we know that in Russia there exists high inequality based on regions and based on the type of settlement. So we also have this divide between urban and rural Russia. Probably it's not as drastic as in China, but still it's important to take into account because the cost of living is very different. So by this approach, we can also take into account these inequalities. We can use not national median, but the median by settlement or the median by the regions. And we can see that the general configuration of the income stratification model still remains the same. It also has this wide middle strata. I wouldn't go into details describing the living conditions and specifics of the groups, but you can find these tables in the paper that I submitted for the conference, but I would just point out a few important things that we can see. First of all, we can see that consumption opportunities are very widely expanded from when we move from the poor to the high income group, and it is most noticeable on the such consumption opportunities that are not typical for the population in whole. For example, vacations abroad, paying for the children's education, and so on and so forth. So the difference between groups are very, very drastic in this respect. Second, we can talk about median group as a representative of the general level of living in Russian society, because that is the group that has the median income. So it's typical for Russia. It's typical living standard for current modern Russia. And if we talk about this living standard, it's not very high. Actually, it's very, very modest. So we can see that only 1/5 of the median group is satisfied with their material well-being. They have virtually no opportunities to expand their consumption. They do not have very wide opportunities to invest in their human capital, and they don't have a very high safety margins, so only about 20% have any kind of savings that allow them to live for at least for a few months. So this, again, we see that this middle strata in Russia is quite large, but the standard of living of this large middle strata is very, very modest. At the same time, we can see that the choice of consumption, the opportunity to choose different consumption models, to choose what they want to spend money for, is typical only for high-income group and maybe partly for middle class. It can be seen in the ownership of some durable goods that are not typical for Russian society so far. Another interesting, so basically I've provided just one table, but we have analyzed different aspects of living of these income groups, and we have come to the conclusion that we can say that the divide between well-off and not so well-off population currently in Russia lies between median group and middle class. So about at the level of 125 median, we can draw this border and say that the people who are below it can be called not so well-off, and the people above can be called a well-off population. And this proportion is about 60-40. If we try to put this picture against the international background, it is always interesting to see what kind of place we hold in the world, to what countries it makes us closer and to what countries we are different. Again, we can see that income stratification, even with relative approach put us closer to the Western European countries, but not to Venezuela or China or other BRIC countries. I do not have them on the picture, but that refers to Brazil and China as well, and India. Well, Venezuela and China share many similarities, and among them relatively small middle-income group, but a large proportion of low-income groups. Russia is different. And we can see that the general configuration is very close to that of Germany or Hungary, so high volume of middle-income strata. But again, the level of income, of course, is different. So if we take into account the absolute level of incomes in these countries, the German model will be higher, the Russian model will be lower, but still, again, the general configuration is the same. If we look at the dynamics of the groups, what was happening in Russia during the last years? It is also very interesting because it provides a slightly different picture from when we analyze the inequality based, for example, on Gini coefficient. We can see that there has been a very prominent trend on the equalization of the incomes, on the people falling into this middle income group. We can see that the high income group has been decreasing in its size, the poorer group has been decreasing in its size very notably, but the median group and the middle class have been expanding over the course of the last 20 years. And now it is the dominant group in the Russian population, again comprising about 1/3, and we started from 1/4 in 1994. So we are seeing this trend towards the equalization of incomes, towards the expanding middle income strata, and that is also what is happening on the world scale. But we also see the same problems that we see on the global scale, because people are dissatisfied with the inequality. And actually, while we are seeing the expansion of the middle income group, we are seeing the intensifying of dissatisfaction with inequalities in Russian society. And the problem of inequalities is becoming more and more important. So the question is why this conversion of incomes and the growth of middle income group is still goes along with the high dissatisfaction. So if we look at the other facts that we know about income inequality, so from my presentation, 2 points that I want to once again intensify is that Russia's income stratification is currently more similar to those of developed countries than developing countries. It's marked by broad middle strata, the absence of extreme poverty, though level of income is lower in absolute terms. And dynamics shows a notable expansion of the middle stratum and contraction of high income and low income groups. If we add some facts that we know from statistics and from other researchers, we can also say that estimates of income inequality related to distribution of income among the mass strata usually puts Russia as a country of high inequality, but not the extreme one, not, for example, not as in the Midwest. But Russia is characterized at the same time with a very high concentration of wealth and incomes. If we talk about inequality in terms of concentration of wealth and incomes in the hands of top 1% or top 5%, different data and different sources puts Russia as a world leader of inequality. Yeah, that's the last slide. So this seems like a paradoxical picture, because from one hand, the inequality is decreasing. We can see the increase of the middle income groups, but at the same time, there still remains the problem of the top that is very far away from the mass strata of the population. And this growing equalization may also not meet the needs of the middle class and most educated and qualified Russian, because the risks of losing their positions is falling. So the problem might be why the dissatisfaction is growing. The problem might be that people are dissatisfied not with the inequality in the mass strata, because Russians usually, according to the survey data, are quite tolerant towards inequalities that are based on meritocratic foundations. So the problem might be not in the inequality as such, but on the foundations of this equality. And the decreasing of the high income group, of the wealthy group, might show that the people do not have the chances to enter it, but they think that it should be possible. So all of this provides a few challenges for socioeconomic policies, because there should be different measures made at aimed at the inequality in the broad strata and the inequalities between the top and the other strata. We also have to take into account non-monetary inequalities that we haven't talked about, but they also can provide quite a basis for dissatisfaction, and ensuring an institutional environment that would stabilize the incomes of the middle, like average Russian.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, I had to stop you.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
May I request the discussant Hartmut Lehmann to come and discuss the paper?
Okay, if somebody can put the thing. Okay, thanks for inviting me to discuss this paper. I should say that there are lots of people in the room here who know a lot more about inequality in Russia, about income stratification. I'm a labor economist, and but who has worked a little bit on Russia. So, so one should keep that. One should keep that in mind. So it's this one, yeah. No, not this one. This one. That's it. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. So it's a very interesting paper, and. I hope my comments, again, I think it's a sociological piece of work, and you know, and so my slant on this, is of course that of an economist. So I hope I don't seem to be too harsh with some of my comments. So the main focus of the paper, and I also should say that I, of course, comment on the paper, not on the presentation, which was slightly larger in terms of topics than the paper. Okay, so the paper focuses on distribution of income, stratifying the population into 5 groups: poor group, less or equal to half the median income, the vulnerable group between half and 0.7, 5 of the median income, the median group, the middle class, and the high income group. The stratification is done for the years 94 to 2017 at the country level, I think using the RLMS data. And the stratification at the regional and settlement level is only done in the paper, at least for 1 year, for 2017. So I'll come to that in a minute. Okay. Now, the interesting results here are regarding the dynamics. Of course, the shares of the poor and the rich, if you want to call people with above twice the median income rich, have been roughly halved between 1994 and 2017. When stratification is done by settlement or region in 2017, the share of these groups are even smaller. So there is a convergence, if you like, towards median and middle class income. And on this measure of stratification, the income distribution in Russia has become much more equal. When one looks at the graph that was shown by Svetlana, the share of the vulnerable has actually remained pretty stable over the whole period at around 16%. Now let me have some comments. I did a paper which ironically we submitted to the Review of Income and Wealth, but some bizarre referee spent 5 pages to basically reject our paper, so we never published it there. And we published it in Research and Labor Economics. So basically we had a paper on the distribution of earnings and basically most people in Russia have only income because they work, so they have income from labor. So if you look at the years 1994 and 1996, basically wage arrears might have had a big impact on the distribution of income. The reason being that the RLMS has a window of 1 month. But as we know, people were repaid these arrears over time. And so if you take a wider window, you get a different income, you get different income levels than if you use this narrow window. So in these years, 94 to 96, when wage arrears were very large in Russia, income might be mismeasured, basically. So what we did, we estimated a counterfactual distribution as if everybody got paid, and if you do that, the income distribution was a lot less unequal. And if you look, for example, at the graph in 1995 and 1996, you have this going up a lot of the poor people who have very little income. So this could be this could be a problem. So essentially, the dynamics of stratified income might be somewhat distorted. Again, the share of the poor is especially high in 1996, which could be partially due to the way income or wages or earnings are measured. Okay, now, now it would be useful, and I think I don't know why, I mean, sometimes people do this, that they only take 1 year, as if this has a meaning. For economists, this has little meaning. You should have basically reproduced figure 1, which looks at the whole country, for the settlement level, which you can do using the RLMS. Because I think at the settlement level, at the type of settlement, the RLMS is probably representative of Russia. And then compare these dynamics to the country level dynamics. Because by just looking at the endpoint, it doesn't tell me much. Now, estimating the distribution at the regional data with RLMS data, or at the regional level, I should say, with RLMS data makes little sense in my opinion. I mean, you acknowledge this. So one way to think about this is there's a lot of work on regional convergence in Russia, and basically splitting regions in high growth regions and low growth regions. And you can take from the RLMS data where you have high growth region represented and low growth regions represented. So maybe you should look at this large literature on regional clubs in Russia and also how their growth performance is spatially correlated. You have to take this into account when you look at how the dynamics of regional income evolves over time, I think. Okay, now some general comments. Again, this is from an economist's point of view. Essentially, the paper derives and describes the dynamics of a dependent variable, which is this stratified income. The paper in the presentation, you did this in your last slide a bit, but the paper does not discuss at all the factors that drive the dependent variable. So can this fact that we have this increase in this median range and also in the middle class range, is this due to maybe changes in the educational system? Can economic policies explain these dynamics? Can the adoption of at-the-frontier technology occurring partially in the economy, not all firms, but some firms do this, explain these dynamics? Can the massive reallocation of labor in the wake of the restructuring of the economy explain some of these dynamics? So, just to look at the dependent variable, of course, it's interesting, but I would like to know what are the determinants of this. Do you have some ideas about this? Now, my second comment, and with this I conclude, the results can be interpreted in a positive way or in a negative way. Since 1990, relative poverty has been decreasing substantially. So it basically has been halved if we take your measure, on your measure. But it's also true, since the 1990s, the share of those with high earnings opportunities have been halved. So that, one could think of this as a negative development, that in the 90s, in early 2000, you had lots of people who were able to generate quite a lot of income, more than twice the median. This share has really shrunk. This share has really shrunk a lot. Is that a good development? I'm not so sure. So where's the Russian economy heading? It looks like towards an equilibrium with not terribly low, but relatively moderate earnings opportunities for more than half the population. And at the same time, many of the previously high earners are pushed into a lower income category. Now, you compare Russia with Venezuela and some other countries, but I think Russia is a post-transition economy. And so, actually one could characterize these economies. I mean, they haven't arrived at, despite what Branko said, they're not really capitalist economies like the US or like Western economies. They are middle-income countries with, and I mean by that the Central European countries in the EU and the CIS countries. They are middle-income countries with post-socialist characteristics. So it would have been interesting to look at the income stratification of that set of countries, because they are different because of institutes where they come from than any of these other countries you take as a comparator.
Thank you.
So with that, I conclude.